In the heart of a Wyoming whiteout, a young mother folded her body around her little girl, trying to turn her own ribs into a wall against the wind. Somewhere behind them, a dark SUV vanished into the storm, leaving only tire tracks that the snow began to erase like a cruel secret. The child's mittened hands clung to her mother's neck as she whispered, "Mom, why isn't Daddy coming back?" Her question drifted into the blizzard, swallowed whole. But miles away, a Navy SEAL on a winter survival check slowed mid-step. Beside him, his German shepherd stiffened ears high, sensing something human where there should have been nothing but ice and silence. Something was wrong. Something in that frozen night was begging to be found. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story grips your heart, subscribe for more true-to-life tales of courage, faith, and the kind of loyalty that pulls people back from the edge. Your support truly means the world. Snow hammered the Wyoming mountains, blurring the pines into pale ghosts and grinding the world down to nothing but white and wind. Cole Harris moved through it with the practiced patience of a man who had long ago accepted that nature never negotiated. At 37, he was tall and rangy, built of lean muscle and habits honed by years in the Navy SEALs. A faint white scar cut from his left eyebrow down toward his cheek, a reminder of a night raid that had gone wrong and of the 2 men he hadn't brought home. Since then, something in him had hardened toward himself but softened toward everyone else. He carried other people's safety like a weight he refused to set down. His gray-green eyes scanned the terrain constantly, even now on what the Navy called winter survival training, and what he called being alone with his thoughts a little too long. Beside him trotted Ranger, his German shepherd. Ranger was 5 years old, big-chested and powerful, his coat a blend of sable, black, and tan that looked almost bronze under the occasional flash of daylight. His ears stood high and alert, his amber eyes watchful, intelligent, always flicking between the trail ahead and the man he trusted more than anything. Ranger had been bred for work, disciplined, steady under gunfire, fearless in the dark. But when it came to people in pain, he turned into something else entirely, a quiet, breathing bridge that let terrified strangers feel safe enough to keep talking, to keep breathing. Cole had seen hardened soldiers grip that fur and cry. He'd seen children fall asleep with their fingers buried in Ranger's ruff, nightmares quieted for one more night. The snow deepened as they climbed along the narrow service road that snaked through the forest. Cole's radio crackled at his hip, the distant voice from base a soft hum in the background. His assignment was simple on paper: check a remote section of trail that had been cut off by the storm, make sure no stray hikers or hunters had gotten trapped out here. Simple usually meant, no one will thank you if you succeed, and everyone will blame you if you miss someone. He was used to that. A sudden break in the monotony snagged his attention. On the otherwise smooth skin of snow, a dark groove slashed sideways, then curved wildly as if a vehicle had skidded. Cole slowed, breath ghosting in front of him. A set of fresh tire tracks veered off the main road, wobbling, then coming to a stop at the edge of the tree line. He crouched, the snow squeaking under his knees, and brushed at the edges with a gloved hand. The tracks weren't yet softened by falling snow. Whoever had driven here hadn't left long ago. Beside the tracks, larger impressions dug into the powder. Boot prints, adult-sized, heel-deep, purposeful at first. Alongside them, much smaller prints appeared, barely more than ovals. A child's winter boots, the steps short, trying to keep up. After several yards, the small prints began to drag, toes gouging trails. Cole felt his chest tighten the way it did when he heard the first crack of distant gunfire. Fear, sharpened into focus rather than panic. "Ranger," he said quietly. "Track." Ranger lowered his head, drawing in the scents trapped in the cold air, tail stiffening. Then he let out a low rumble in his chest and moved forward into the trees, not with the excited bounce of a game, but with a controlled urgency that told Cole he smelled something wrong. Sweat gone sour with fear, human skin chilled toward hypothermia. That strange, metallic tang that the body gives off when it's close to giving up. Cole followed, weaving between snow-laden pines, stepping in Ranger's tracks to save energy. The world narrowed to breath, movement, and the distant thud of his heartbeat. He thought, briefly, of the last time he'd been too late. A village overseas, a storm of a different kind, the face of a boy who had waited inside a collapsed house that no one had believed could hold survivors. Command had pulled Cole's team out at dawn. They'd found the boy's body 3 days later when the weather cleared. Since then, Cole had lived with a quiet vow. If someone out there was still breathing, he would not be the man who turned away first. Ranger gave a sharp bark and plunged down into a shallow hollow between the trees. Cole slid after him, snow filling his boots. There, beneath the twisted trunk of a fallen pine, he saw them. The woman looked almost sculpted out of frost. She was in her late 20s, maybe, small-framed, but strong the way people get strong from carrying things heavier than groceries. Dark hair clung in damp strands to her cheeks, which were mottled blue and white from the cold. Her skin had that waxy pallor that made Cole's stomach flip. He'd seen it in too many bodies. But her chest still rose, shallow and ragged. She curled herself around a little girl of about 5, using her own body as a shield against the wind. The child's pink hat was dusted with ice. A few wisps of light brown hair peeked out. Her eyelashes were spiked with snow, her lips tinted purple. Tiny fingers clutched at the woman's coat, as if even unconscious she refused to let go. "Hey," Cole said, dropping to his knees beside them, his voice low and steady, the way he spoke to teammates bleeding out in the dark. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The woman's eyes fluttered open. They were hazel, ringed with red from cold and from something older, the kind of tired that didn't come from weather. She tried to focus on his face, confusion and fear fighting through the fog. Is she?" Her voice cracked, more air than sound. "She's here," Cole said quickly. "I've got you, both of you." He shrugged off his pack with practiced speed, pulling out a metallic emergency blanket and a thermal wrap. As he draped the blanket over them, he couldn't help noticing the edges of yellowing bruises along her jaw. Half hidden, under the chill. Old marks, finger-shaped, the kind you didn't get from falling on ice. Something cold that had nothing to do with the snow slid down his spine. Ranger pressed himself against the little girl's side, his body a living heater. The child made a faint sound, a whimper that could have been pain or a dream, and buried her face in his thick fur. Ranger went completely still, then slowly exhaled, as if he understood this small, trembling weight was now his to carry too. "What's your name?" Cole asked the woman as he uncapped a metal flask and held it to her lips for a tiny sip of warm liquid. Her hands shook too hard to hold it herself. "Emily," she whispered. The name seemed to cost her effort. "She's Grace." Her gaze darted to the child, terror flaring. "Please, don't let her." "Emily, look at me," Cole said. His tone sharpened just enough to cut through the panic without turning into a command. "Grace is cold, but she's still fighting. So are you. I'm going to get you both out of here. There's a cabin a few miles north. Friends of mine, older couple. Warm fire, hot drinks. You just have to stay with me until then. Can you do that?" She stared at him as if trying to decide whether to believe in him or in the memory of whoever had left her here. For a heartbeat, despair almost won. He saw it in the slump of her shoulders. Then she glanced down at Grace, at the small fist tangled in Ranger's fur, and something hard and fierce lit behind her eyes. "I'll walk," she whispered. If you take her." "I'm not asking you to walk," Cole said. In one smooth motion, he slid his arms under Emily and the child together, lifting them as carefully as if they were made of glass and fire both. The weight strained his muscles, but it was a familiar burn, the kind that told him he was doing the one thing his body had always been built for, carrying someone who couldn't carry themselves. "Ranger, with me." As he started the climb back toward the old logging trail that led to the cabin, the wind rose, howling through the trees like something wild and angry. Snow stung his exposed skin. Emily's head rested against his shoulder. He could feel the faint tremors still rippling through her. Grace was a small, unmoving warmth between them, her breath feathering dimly against his neck from time to time. Every step felt like walking a tightrope between in time and too late. In the distance, barely visible through the curtain of white, a glow flickered, the promise of Tom and Linda's cabin, of heat and human voices. Cole tightened his grip and pushed on, the thought forming in his mind not as words, but as a cold certainty that made his jaw clench. Someone had driven out here with a woman and a child and left them to the storm on purpose. And if the blizzard wasn't the only thing that wanted these two gone from the world, then what was? By the time Cole reached the cabin, his shoulders burned and his breath came in hard, measured bursts. The little mountain house sat hunched beneath the pines, its roof heavy with snow, windows glowing gold against the blue of the storm. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, carrying the smell of wood and something faintly sweet. He kicked the snow from his boots and rapped once with his elbow before the door swung open. Tom Hunter filled the frame, lantern light catching the lines carved deep into his weathered face. In his early 70s, Tom was still powerfully built, shoulders broad under a wool shirt, gray beard trimmed short around a square jaw. His blue eyes had the wary softness of someone who had seen too much news of the world and decided to step back from it, but not from people. Once, he'd been a mechanic in a small town, the kind of man everyone called when engines died in winter. After losing his only son in a car accident 15 years earlier, he and his wife had sold the shop, retreated to the mountains, trying to build a quieter life out of timber and silence. That grief never left his posture. It lived in the slight stoop when he saw children, in the way his hands shook just a little when someone arrived hurt. "Cole?" he said, voice rough with surprise. Then he saw the bundle in Cole's arms and stepped aside without another word. Inside, Linda appeared from the kitchen, short and soft around the edges, her silver hair twisted into a loose bun that always looked like it was one movement away from falling apart. In her late 60s, she had the kind of face people trusted immediately. Round cheeks, gentle brown eyes, a mouth that seemed more used to smiling than frowning, though grief had left fine cracks at the corners. She had once been a teacher's aide at an elementary school, the kind of woman who carried band-aids and stickers in her pockets. Out here, she mothered anyone who crossed the threshold, whether they wanted it or not. "Set them by the fire," she said, already pulling quilts from a cedar chest. Her voice trembled, but her hands moved with brisk competence. Cole knelt near the stone hearth, laying Emily and Grace carefully onto a thick rug. The fire snapped, throwing heat against his frozen skin. Ranger lay down immediately beside the little girl, pressing his warm flank against her, nose tucked under her chin as if he'd decided this exact spot was now his post. Grace let out a small breath and curled instinctively into him. Emily's teeth chattered uncontrollably as Linda wrapped a quilt around her shoulders. Up close, in the steady light, the bruises stood out more clearly. green-yellow patches along her jaw and neck, a faint darker line near her collarbone, as if a grip had been too tight there once. Cole felt anger spark, low and controlled, the way a fuse catches. He'd seen these patterns before, on bases and back home, on women who insisted they had walked into a door. "We need to warm them, slowly," Cole said, shifting into habit. No hot baths, small sips of warm water, dry clothes. They were barely talking out there. "I'll find something for the little one," Linda murmured, already heading to the back room where she kept old flannel pajamas from a life that had ended too early. Tom added another log to the fire, his movements purposeful, like stoking the blaze might stoke life back into the pair on the floor. After some minutes, color crept back into Grace's cheeks. Linda changed her into an oversized shirt that hung to her ankles, then dried Emily's hair with a towel, hands careful around the bruises. Emily's shivering slowed. She seemed more present now, eyes following voices instead of staring past them. "You're safe here," Linda said softly, tucking the quilt tighter. "I'm Linda. This is Tom. We live up here. Cole's an old friend." Emily's gaze traveled from Linda's face to Tom's, then to Cole kneeling across from her. His hair was damp from melted snow, scars stark against his skin. He looked like a man carved for rough places and hard choices, yet his eyes held nothing but steady concern. Ranger, at Grace's side, lifted his head and looked at Emily too, ears pricked, as if waiting for her to decide something. "Do you remember what happened?" Cole asked, keeping his voice low and even. "You told me your name is Emily, and your daughter is Grace. Can you tell us anything else?" For a moment, Emily's expression wavered between exhaustion and resistance. Years of being told to keep things in, to not make things worse, battled against the raw memory of snow and silence. She swallowed, her fingers tightening in the quilt. "My husband," she began, the word tasting sour. "Brandon Reed. He owns a small tech consulting firm in the city. People like him. He dresses well, talks about charity events, smiles at the right moments. Everyone thinks he's charming." The corner of her mouth twitched, not with amusement, but with something bitter. "At home, he's different. Everything has to be his way. He checks my phone, my email. Grace can't even cry too loud without him telling her she's being dramatic." Linda sat on the arm of a nearby chair, hands folded, giving Emily space, yet radiating a quiet support. Tom leaned against the mantel, jaw tight, eyes darkening as details fell into place he didn't want to see. "I used to work as a nurse," Emily continued, voice halting at first, then gaining a shaky rhythm. "I loved it. I wanted to open a small clinic one day. He told me it was a cute idea, but that a good mother stayed home. Said I didn't need to worry about money, because he handled everything. When I kept talking about going back to work, he pushed harder, locked me out of our accounts, said I was ungrateful." Her fingers moved unconsciously to the bruise near her throat, stopping just short of touching it. Cole's mind catalogued the information, but his chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with data. He'd heard versions of this before, in bases overseas and subdivisions back home. Control disguised as care, cages painted the color of love. "A few months ago," Emily whispered, "I found a folder in his office. He'd bought a life insurance policy for me. A big one. The kind of number that makes people act stupid. I wasn't even told. And there's a fund my parents set up when Grace was born, for her education, her future. I saw emails he'd sent a financial advisor about restructuring. When I asked about it, he said I was snooping, that I didn't understand how these things worked. But his eyes..." She shook her head, remembering the sudden flatness there. "He looked at me like I was a problem he needed to solve." Grace stirred, a small sound escaping her as she shifted against Ranger. The dog responded by licking her hand once, then resting his head there. The little girl's fingers curled around his ear, even in sleep. For a second, Emily's face softened as she watched. Then the memory dragged her back. "He said we needed a break," she went on. "A trip to the mountains, fresh air, a change of scenery. He was almost kind that morning. Helped pack the car, put Grace's favorite toy in the back seat. I wanted to believe it meant something, that maybe he was trying." Her eyes glistened now. She blinked hard, as if fighting the tears was a habit. "We drove for hours. He turned off the main road onto this narrow trail. I asked if he was sure. He laughed, said he knew a spot where the snow was perfect for Grace to play." Cole felt his fists curl slowly on his knees. He forced them to relax. "He stopped the car," Emily said. "Told us to get out, stretch our legs. I took Grace's hand. We stepped into the snow. I turned for just a second to pull her hat down over her ears." Her voice shook. "When I looked up, he was back in the driver's seat. The door slammed. The wheels spun. The car just started moving." The room seemed to shrink around her words. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, a muffled roar. "I ran after him," Emily choked, tears finally spilling. "I was holding Grace, slipping, shouting his name. The sound disappeared into the storm. He didn't break. Not once. Grace looked at me and asked, 'Mommy, why isn't Daddy coming back?' She covered her mouth with her hand, shoulders shaking. What am I supposed to tell her?" Ranger shifted away from Grace just enough to press his muzzle gently against Emily's wrist. His eyes, deep and steady, met hers, and something in her broke open. She let out a sob that she had clearly been swallowing for years, honest and unshaped by fear of punishment. Words tumbled after it, details she hadn't meant to say, about slammed doors and apologies that never lasted, about how small she had learned to make herself in her own home. Cole listened, not interrupting, assembling the jagged pieces in his mind. Unexplained bruises, a secret insurance policy, Grace's fund, a carefully chosen lonely road in a storm that could erase tracks. When Emily finally fell quiet, breathing ragged but freer, Cole glanced at Tom and Linda. Their faces mirrored his own thought. This was bigger than one violent argument gone too far. This was architecture. Design. He looked back at Emily, at Grace asleep between Ranger's paws, at the thin line of determination that had somehow survived in a woman who'd been left in the snow like trash. The question forming in his mind felt less like a thought and more like a warning. If this wasn't just a case of a man who hid his family, but a fully planned attempt to erase them, what exactly had he just stepped into? Morning crept in as a dull gray smear behind the frosted windows, the storm's rage settling into a slow, relentless fall. Cole sat at Tom's old pine kitchen table, a mug of black coffee cooling between his hands, his phone lying face up beside it. In the next room, he could hear the soft murmur of Linda's voice as she coaxed Grace to sip hot chocolate, the faint rustle of Emily moving carefully, as if any sudden motion might draw punishment out of the walls. Ranger sprawled at Cole's feet, head across his boots, but his ears twitched with each sound in the cabin. Cole scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he'd been avoiding for months: Noah Miller. Miller was 40, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a cop's straight spine and the tired eyes of someone who had spent too long in rooms full of lies. He worked as a federal agent now, the kind that spent more time with financial records than with handcuffs, but he had started in street units, chasing dealers and cleaning up after domestic disputes that never made the news. They had met overseas when Miller had been attached to an intelligence task force. A blown operation and a messy extraction had left Miller with a permanent limp and Cole with another scar. After that night, Their respect for each other stopped being theoretical. Miller answered on the fourth ring, his voice low and gravelly, like someone who lived on coffee and bad lighting. "Harris, thought you'd forgotten I exist." Cole didn't bother with pleasantries. He laid out what he had: Emily's story, the secret life insurance policy, her parents' fund for Grace, the fact that Brandon had driven his wife and child into a storm and left them. As he talked, Ranger shifted, as if feeling the tension tightening his muscles. There was a rustle of paper and keyboard clicks on the other end as Miller began to dig even before Cole finished. "Text me her full name, his full name, dates, anything you've got," Miller said. "Give me a few hours." The call ended, leaving Cole alone again with his thoughts and the steady hum of the cabin. When he stepped into the main room, he saw Emily sitting on the couch, a blanket around her shoulders, Grace curled up with her head in Linda's lap. Tom was by the window, scanning the pale forest as if expecting the world to come knocking. Emily's eyes met Cole's for a moment, full of a fragile mixture of gratitude and dread. He nodded once, a quiet promise he wasn't entirely sure he could keep yet. Hours later, as the light started to fade again, his phone buzzed. Cole stepped onto the porch to take the call, the air biting at his cheeks. Miller didn't waste time. "It's worse than you thought," he said. "Your guy Brandon bought a 7-figure policy on Emily about a year ago. No medical red flags, no reason for that kind of coverage unless you're expecting a payout." There was a pause, more typing. "And that education fund for the kid? He's been talking to a boutique advisor about restructuring into a limited liability company. The proposed entity is effectively a shell that he controls. Once everything's inside, he could move it wherever he wants. Honestly, it reads like a playbook. Lock down the assets, then arrange a tragic accident." Cole stared at the snow piling up on the railing, jaw tightening. "Can you move on him?" "Not yet," Miller said, frustration sharpening his words. "What I've got is suspicious, not criminal. I can open a file, start pulling full records, but you know how slow this gets. You're there, I'm not. Just don't do anything that makes my life harder, like breaking a dozen federal statutes in one night." His tone softened a fraction. "Keep her and the kid hidden. And Harris, be careful. Guys like this, they're fragile under the polish. Corner them and they break funny." When the call ended, Cole stood for a long moment, listening to the wind. The situation had shifted from bad to structurally dangerous. He walked back inside, filled Tom and Linda in as simply as he could, leaving out the numbers but not the intent. Emily listened, her face draining of color, but there was no surprise in her eyes, only the sick confirmation of something she had been afraid to name. "So what now?" Tom asked, crossing his arms over his chest, voice low. "We just sit here and hope no one comes looking?" Sitting still had never been Cole's way. "No," he said. "We buy time, and we get proof he never thought anyone would look for." When the snow eased to a steady curtain and the road down the mountain was no longer suicidal, Cole loaded his truck. Emily and Grace stood in the doorway, bundled in layers, Ranger nudging Grace's hand with his nose. "You're not coming?" Emily asked, fear and something like guilt flickering across her face. "If he finds out you helped—" "He won't," Cole cut in gently. "Tom and Linda will keep you safe here. No one knows this cabin unless they've been brought to it. I'll be faster alone. Ranger and I will take a look around your life back down there. See what he left lying around when he thought you'd never come back." Grace stared up at him, clutching a mug of cocoa in both hands. "Will you come back?" she asked, voice small. Ranger stepped closer and gave a soft woof, almost a promise. Cole felt the question land somewhere deep. "Yeah, kiddo," he said. "We'll come back." The drive to town was a transition from wilderness to carefully curated normal. Streetlights pooled warm light onto plowed roads, coffee shops glowed, and houses lined up with perfect symmetry, pretending the world was predictable. Cole parked 2 blocks from Brandon's office building, a glass and steel box pretending to be important among smaller brick structures. It was after hours. The lot was almost empty. He watched for a while, mapping entrances, cameras, security patterns. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, eyes tracking every movement on the sidewalk. They spent the afternoon quietly probing the edges of Brandon's world. At the bank, Cole stood in line like any other customer, catching a glimpse of Brandon's name on a list of preferred clients behind the counter. At a corner cafe, he watched a man in an expensive coat, sharp jaw, slicked back hair, the kind of confident gait that came from never being told no, step out of a neighboring building, laughing with a woman in a gray suit. Even at a distance, Cole recognized Brandon from the framed family photo Emily had described, the same fixed smile that never reached his eyes. The woman he was with had neat features, her dark hair pinned back severely, a leather portfolio under one arm. Probably the financial advisor, Cole thought, the architect helping to move the pieces. Ranger sat with his head near the cracked window, nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly as Brandon passed. The dog's body went tense, a low sound humming in his chest, the closest thing he had to language for. This scent matters. That night, under a sky clear and brittle with cold, Cole drove to Brandon's gated subdivision, where lawns were manicured and houses tried not to look like copies of each other. He parked on a side street, slipped into dark clothing, pulled a knit cap low. Ranger moved at his heel, a shadow that breathed. They hopped a back fence where the snow had drifted high, landing silently in Brandon's yard. Security cameras blinked along the roofline. Cole studied their arcs, then moved through their blind spots with the ease of someone who had spent a career not being seen when it mattered most. Ranger hugged the walls, belly low, paw steps barely crunching. At the back door, Cole used a small device to nudge the alarm system into temporary sleep. Inside, the house smelled of citrus cleaner, expensive cologne, and the faint ghost of cigarette smoke. Emily had said Brandon had quit years ago. Another lie. They moved through a kitchen full of stone countertops and curated emptiness, then down a hallway lined with framed certificates and family photos that now felt like props. Brandon beaming in a tailored suit. Emily smiling with careful politeness. Grace on his lap as a toddler, his hands holding her too tightly. Cole's jaw locked, but he pressed on. In the office, dark wood and leather signaled seriousness. A large abstract painting dominated the wall behind the desk. It took Cole less than a minute to find the hinge, swing the canvas outward, and reveal the small safe set into the drywall. He slipped a compact stethoscope-like device into his ears, fingers working the dial with patient, practiced movements. Numbers clicked into place like reluctant confessions. When the safe opened, the air inside was colder. There was no cash, just neat stacks of paper. Cole worked quickly, pulling files out, using his phone to photograph each page in the glow of a small pen light, a transfer agreement moving a significant portion of Grace's fund into a newly formed company with an opaque name. Printed emails between Brandon and the dark-haired advisor he'd seen earlier, discussing asset repositioning ahead of potential claims, and one line that made Cole's stomach turn. Once the accident is resolved, we can finalize the daughter's portion as discussed. As he reached the last file, Ranger gave a soft, urgent whine, the sound barely louder than a breath, but loaded with warning. Head tilted, ears pricked, he stared toward the front of the house. Then Cole heard it too, the crunch of tires on the driveway, the chirp of a car lock, the metallic rattle of a key in the front door. In one fluid motion, Cole slid the papers back inside, shut the safe, swung the painting into place, and killed the penlight. The office plunged into darkness. Steps sounded in the foyer, accompanied by laughter and the murmur of a second, lower voice. Cole and Ranger slipped out the back hall, moving fast but disciplined. In the kitchen, he saw headlights painting the snow through the window, silhouettes crossing the glass. Brandon's lean frame, and another man, broader, carrying a briefcase. The trip was necessary, Brandon was saying, his tone annoyingly relaxed. Sometimes the mess has to look natural. Just make sure no one ever sees that we changed the route. The voices grew louder as they approached. Cole eased the back door open a sliver, slipped into the yard with Ranger glued to his heel, then pulled it shut. They ducked behind a thick stand of evergreens as the interior lights flicked on, shining out into the night like a search beam. Cole dropped flat against the snow. Ranger pressed alongside him, the dog's body vibrating with contained energy. The scent of Brandon's cologne and cigarette smoke drifted on the cold air as the man moved through the house, only a few meters away. Ranger did not bark. He simply looked at Cole, eyes reflecting faint starlight, waiting for the cue that would mean run or fight. Lying there, heart pounding in time with the dog's breathing, Cole had a sudden, clear thought that settled like ice in his gut. Once Brandon realized someone had touched the secrets in his safe, he would start hunting for leaks. And then, how long would Emily and Grace be safe on that mountain? 3 days after the break-in, the storm loosened its grip on the mountains, but the world below grew stranger. Cole watched the news from a motel room, the television light flickering over his face. On screen, Brandon sat in front of a tasteful bookshelf, his blonde hair combed back, navy sweater perfectly fitted. Under the studio lights, he looked like every sympathetic husband in every scripted tragedy. His blue eyes glistened as he spoke into the camera, fingers twisting a wedding band for effect. "My wife and daughter went missing in that blizzard," he said, voice cracking at all the right moments. "They were my whole life. If anyone has seen them—" He stopped, swallowed, looked down. The reporter's expression softened, the caption reading, "Devastated husband pleads for help." Cole muted the sound before he had to hear another word. The lie was almost flawless. Almost. He could see it in the way Brandon's jaw tightened when he thought no one was watching, the faint boredom sliding into his eyes when the reporter talked too long and the attention wasn't on him. Ranger lay on the motel bed, head on his paws, watching the silent image with the wary stillness he reserved for things that did not smell right. The phone on the nightstand buzzed. Cole picked it up. Miller's voice came through, sharper than before. "We've got enough to open real charges now. The emails you grabbed, the transfer drafts, plus what we've pulled from his financials. It's ugly. I've looped in the local DA. But until we have Emily and Grace on record, giving statements, it's all paper. I can't move as fast as he can lie on TV." "Witness protection," Cole said, staring at Brandon's frozen face on the screen. "You mentioned it." "Yeah," Miller replied. "We can get her and the kid into a safe house out of state, new routines, security. But it only works if we get them off that mountain before he realizes his house has been touched." There was a pause, then a quieter admission. "And I think he's already suspicious. His attorney called the bank this morning asking about any unusual inquiries. I don't like that." Cole didn't either. Cold settled under his ribs. He checked his watch, calculating. "I'm going back up now," he said. "We move tonight." The drive into the mountains felt different this time. The trees seemed closer, the road narrower. By the time he reached the hidden turnoff to Tom and Linda's cabin, dusk was already bleeding into night. Inside, the air smelled of stew and pine, and the faint sweetness of Linda's cinnamon tea. Grace sat on the floor with Ranger, lining up small wooden animals Linda had dug out of an old box. Emily perched on the edge of the couch, as if ready to spring up at the slightest noise. Her face looked a little less hollow than it had the first night, but sleep still hadn't fully smoothed the fear from around her eyes. Tom was at the table, oiling an old hunting rifle more out of habit than intent, while Linda knitted absent-mindedly, the yarn pooling in her lap. When Cole laid out what Miller had said, the room went very quiet. "They can hide you," he told Emily. "New place, new routine. You give your statement, Miller builds the case. Brandon gets pulled into court instead of onto talk shows. It's not perfect, but it's a real shot." Emily stared at her hands twisted in the blanket. "And Grace?" she asked softly. "She'd have to change schools, leave everything she knows." She trailed off, catching her own words and almost laughing. "Everything she knows is this cabin and that dog right now." Grace, who had been arranging a miniature wooden bear, looked up. "Are we going somewhere?" she asked. She looked smaller in the lamplight, but her gaze was clear, searching faces carefully the way children do when they already know something bad is happening. "Somewhere safer," Cole said, crouching down to her level. "Where your dad can't get to you. There'll be other kids, maybe even another dog. But Ranger and I will visit, okay? You won't be alone." Grace slipped her hand into Ranger's fur, fingers curling tightly. "Will Grandma Linda and Grandpa Tom be safe?" she whispered. No one had told her to call them that, but the names had arrived anyway, carried by the warmth in how they held her. Tom's jaw twitched. Linda blinked hard and smiled. "We'll be fine, sweetheart," Linda said. "We're too stubborn to scare that easy." They began to pack what little Emily and Grace owned now. A few clothes, some borrowed boots, a drawing Grace had made of Ranger with a crown tilted on his head. Cole stepped outside to call Miller, read off the coordinates. "We'll stage a pickup near the old service road in 3 hours, Miller said. "I'll be there with the sheriff. Keep everyone inside until then. Don't take risks. He's desperate." "When have I ever taken unnecessary risks?" Cole muttered, earning a snort from Miller before the line cut. Cole slipped the phone into his pocket and reached for the door handle, then froze. Ranger, who had followed him out quietly, stood rigid on the porch. The dog's ears were pointed straight ahead, nose lifted, drawing in the air. A low growl vibrated in his chest, not loud but deep, the kind that came from instinct older than training. "What is it, boy?" Cole murmured. Ranger stepped forward to the edge of the porch, eyes fixed on the curve of the snow-covered track below. A moment later, Cole saw it, twin cones of light cutting through the dark between the trees. A vehicle engine, muffled but undeniable, crept up the unmarked path that only a handful of people knew existed. His pulse spiked. "Inside," he whispered. Ranger moved without question, slipping back through the door. Cole followed, shutting it softly behind him. "We've got company," he said. Headlights on the track. Linda's hand flew to her mouth. Tom grabbed his coat, every line of his body tightening. "Could be a ranger," Tom offered, though his tone said he didn't believe it. "Or some lost hunter." "Hunters don't come up this far in this weather," Cole replied. He moved to the small front window, pushed the curtain aside just enough to peer through. The truck stopped farther down than he expected, its lights cutting off abruptly. The shapes that stepped out were dark against the snow, but the posture was unmistakable. Brandon's tall, self-assured stride, shoulders relaxed as if he owned any ground he walked on. Beside him, a shorter, thicker man in a heavy jacket, his head on a swivel, hands buried in his pockets in a way that suggested more than cold. Money and fear had bought directions that should never have been for sale. "He found us," Emily breathed, voice paper-thin. Panic flickered across her face, then hardened into something more protective as she looked at Grace. The girl had gone very still, her hand tightening again in Ranger's fur. His presence kept her from bolting, but her eyes shone with growing terror. Cole turned from the window, mind shifting into the crisp, layered thinking that had kept him alive in worse places than this. Tom, you and Linda stall them at the door. Keep them talking as long as you can, but don't argue. Don't provoke. Just confused and slow. Emily, Grace, you're coming out the back with me. There's a gully that leads to the service road. We can circle wide and meet Miller's team. Tom gave a sharp nod, reaching for the old rifle more for confidence than combat. Linda squared her shoulders, wiping her hands on her apron like she was about to welcome the rudest dinner guest of her life. Emily stood, her legs wobbling, but when Grace reached for her, she straightened, strength forced into her spine. "Do what he says," Tom murmured to Emily. "We'll be right behind you." The first knock rattled the cabin a heartbeat later, loud and impatient. Tom and Linda moved toward the front. Cole ushered Emily and Grace to the back door, snow-dusted boots already lined up. Ranger trotted beside them, glancing back once toward the sound of the knock, then forward again, choosing his side. As they stepped out into the sharp cold, the wood of the cabin walls seemed suddenly thin. Cole led them along the shadowed side, keeping low. Behind them, through the log walls, Brandon's voice floated faintly, smooth and offended. "My wife and daughter's car was found near here. Surely you'd want to help, unless you've got some reason not to." The back door closed softly at Cole's hand. They moved along a narrow path trampled by years of Tom's footsteps, snow creaking under their weight. Grace clung to Ranger's neck with one hand and to her mother's coat with the other, small breaths puffing white. They had reached the edge of the clearing when the front door slammed open hard, enough to shake the frame. Brandon's shout knifed through the night. "Where are they?" he roared. "I know she's here." The other man's voice was lower, rough, trying to calm him, but rage had slipped the leash. Cole cursed under his breath. "Go," he told Emily, pointing toward the black line of trees where the gully began. "Follow that dip. Don't stop until you see headlights on the other side. Miller's expecting you." "What about you?" Emily whispered, her face pale but eyes blazing now with something beyond fear. He almost smiled. "I've got a different conversation to finish." As Emily pulled Grace along the path, Ranger hesitated, torn. He looked between Cole and the little girl, body taut with conflict. Then he made his choice. He broke into a run, not toward Emily, but in a wide arc back around the cabin. "Ranger," Cole hissed, but there was no panic in it, only understanding. The dog knew his part better than anyone. Ranger's bark split the night, sharp and sudden, from the opposite side of where Emily and Grace were running. It was followed by the crashing of underbrush as he darted through the trees, his movements deliberately loud now, a living lure. Brandon's footsteps pounded across the porch, then onto the snow, veering toward the noise. "There!" he shouted. "I hear something!" Gunmetal glinted briefly in the starlight as he sprinted past the corner of the cabin, the heavier man lumbering after him. Cole moved, cutting through the dark with the precision of training and anger held on a tight leash. He intercepted them near the tree line, silent until the last 3 steps. Then he was there, behind Brandon, his hand snapping down on the gun wrist, twisting hard. The shot that might have echoed through the mountain died in the barrel as the weapon skidded into the snow. Brandon staggered, cursing, swinging blindly with his other fist. Cole drove his shoulder into the man's back, taking him down into the drift, knee in his spine, one arm barred across his neck. The second man froze, hands half raised, eyes wide, realizing too late that this wasn't the kind of confrontation he'd been paid for. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance then, growing louder, joined by the chopping thrum of a helicopter approaching low over the trees. Red and blue strobes began to flicker against the clouds as county cruisers fought their way up the road, Miller's Promise arriving in flashing color. Ranger trotted back to Cole's side, breathing hard, tongue lolling, eyes bright with adrenaline, but fixed on Brandon like a judge waiting for a verdict. A few minutes later, Brandon was yanked to his feet and cuffed, his expensive coat dusted with snow, hair disheveled, charms stripped away when no cameras were pointed at him. He jerked against the restraints, spitting anger. "You don't understand what you've done," he snarled at Emily when she appeared at the edge of the clearing, Grace clinging to her leg. "You're ruining so many lives." She looked at him, really looked, as if seeing clearly for the first time. The terror that had ruled her for years was still there, but now it stood beside a hollow kind of grief for the man she'd once convinced herself existed beneath the cruelty. Freedom, she realized, did not feel like some triumphant anthem. It felt like stepping off a cliff and hoping the ground would catch up. Grace, shaking, buried her face in Ranger's neck. The dog stood firm, letting her clutch as tightly as she needed. Cole watched the scene, the snow, the lights, the small family the universe had just broken and strangely begun to rebuild, and another, quieter question settled over the victory like a shadow. Now that Brandon was finally in chains, would the law truly stand beside a woman who had been silent so long, and could a little girl who had been left for dead in the snow ever learn to trust the word family again? The courtroom smelled of old wood and nerves. High windows let in a thin winter light that turned the dust into slow-falling stars. Emily sat at the witness table in a simple navy dress Linda had pressed that morning, her hair tied back to keep her hands from hiding behind it. She looked smaller than the room, but not swallowed by it anymore. On her right, a court-appointed victim advocate sat close, a woman in her 50s with warm brown skin, cropped gray hair, and a calm presence that seemed to wrap around Emily like a second invisible shawl. Across from them, Brandon occupied the defendant's chair in an ill-fitting suit, his blonde hair still styled, his jaw still sharp, but the polish dulled by nights without sleep. His eyes flicked between Emily and the jury box, searching for sympathy the way he used to search for the camera. Today, fewer people were willing to give it. At the bench, Judge Raymond Keller watched it all with the weary attention of a man who had seen far too many broken households. In his early 60s, Keller was tall and thin, with a deeply lined face and steel-gray hair slicked back. He had started his career as a public defender and never quite lost the habit of looking at defendants as human beings first, mistakes second. It made his voice gentler than some expected, but it also made his sentences land with a certain heavy finality. Next to Emily, Cole sat quietly, in a clean suit that fit a little awkwardly on his broad frame. The scar near his eyebrow stood out under the fluorescent lights. He had testified earlier in the day, detailing how he found Emily and Grace, how he had gone into Brandon's house and brought out the papers that told a story the snow almost had. Now he remained because Emily had asked him to stay within sight. Ranger lay at his feet, an exception the judge had granted after the victim advocate explained that the dog helped the child maintain calm and had training beyond that of a pet. The German shepherd now stretched against Cole's boots, his head turned so one amber eye could keep Grace in view. Grace sat on a bench between Tom and Linda, swinging her feet just above the floor. She wore a second-hand dress with little blue flowers that Linda had altered to fit her and held a small, well-loved stuffed dog in her lap. Every so often, her hand left the toy to rest on Ranger's head. The contact seemed to ground her more than anything the adults did. When Emily described the moment on the mountain road, her voice shook but did not break. She told the jury about the life insurance she had never been told she had, the emails she had glimpsed, the way her questions had turned Brandon's eyes into chips of ice. She spoke about the sound of the car door closing, the engine revving, the snow swallowing her screams. She repeated Grace's question, the one that had haunted her dreams. Why isn't Daddy coming back? Some jurors looked away, blinking fast. Others stared harder, faces set. When the prosecutor laid the financial documents on the overhead projector, the ink on them might as well have been blood. Transfer drafts, emails about restructuring, the cold phrase about finalizing the daughter's portion after the accident. Emily pressed her lips together, jaw tight, as if each page physically hurt to see. Brandon's attorney, a sharp-suited man with a perpetual frown line, tried to spin a narrative of stress, poor judgment, a man pushed too far by finances, and an overly emotional wife. But the story kept collapsing under the weight of facts. Miller testified about the patterns that matched known fraud cases. Cole's photos showed the exact documents that vanished from the safe after the arrest, a disappearance that did Brandon no favors. When the verdict came, the room seemed to stop breathing. Judge Keller read each count carefully. Attempted murder of a spouse, attempted murder of a minor, insurance fraud, embezzlement from a child's trust. Guilty. 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 Brandon's shoulders sagged, his mouth opening on a protest that never quite formed into words. The sentence overshadowed his reaction. Decades in state prison, parole a distant possibility, his financial accomplices referred for separate prosecution. Keller's gaze shifted to Emily and softened just enough to be seen. "Ms. Reed," he said, "the law cannot give you back the years you lost or erase the fear you lived in. What it can do is say as clearly as possible that what was done to you and your daughter was not your fault, and it was not invisible." It was the closest thing to an apology the system knew how to offer. After, in a quieter hearing, the judge signed the papers that made official what had already become real in practice. Emily retained full custody of Grace. A protective order was granted that stretched like an invisible fence miles wide. The trust fund was pulled out of Brandon's reach and placed under the care of a neutral financial firm that explained things slowly, with diagrams, until Emily could nod without pretending. The months that followed did not feel like a fairy tale. They felt like hard work. Emily rented a small house on the outskirts of the same valley that held Tom and Linda's cabin. The place had peeling paint and uneven floors, but the windows looked out onto a line of pines and a sliver of mountain, and there was a hook by the back door where Grace hung her little coat every afternoon. Emily went back to nursing, starting with part-time shifts at the town clinic. Her hands remembered more than she expected. She cleaned scrapes, soothed fevers, checked blood pressure for elderly farmers who called her kiddo, and told her stories about winters from before she was born. At night, exhaustion settled into her bones, but it was a different kind of tired than she had known with Brandon. This tired came from effort she chose. Grace started at a small elementary school where the teacher knew each child's name and the principal lived 2 streets over. In the beginning, she startled at slammed lockers and raised voices, but slowly, with the help of a school counselor who specialized in childhood trauma, she began to draw pictures that were not always about snow and cars and dark roads. Ranger visited the house so often that the neighbors assumed he lived there. On Cole's leave days, the big dog would leap from the truck and bound toward Grace, slowing just in time so she did not get bowled over. He became her shadow on walks, her pillow during movie nights, the silent guardian at the foot of her bed when the wind howled. Emily, at first stiff around Cole, learned to breathe again in his presence. He never raised his voice in the house. He knocked before entering any room, even when invited. If she flinched at a sudden sound, he pretended not to see, just kept talking about something ordinary until the moment passed. One evening, months after the trial, a storm rolled through, sleet tapping at the windows. A flash of lightning threw Emily's mind back to another sky splitting open and to tires spinning in snow. Her breath hitched, heartbeat sprinting. Without a word, Ranger got up from the rug, padded over, and rested his head gently in her lap. Cole, who had been drying dishes, looked over but did not move closer. Emily's hand found Ranger's neck, fingers burying in his fur. She focused on the rise and fall of the dog's breathing, the warmth under her palm. Then she looked up and met Cole's eyes. In them she saw not pity, not impatience, but a quiet certainty that he was not going anywhere. Something inside her, wound tight for years, loosened a little. Years later, the small house gave way to a slightly larger one with a sign out front, Grace Harbor Clinic. The name, painted in simple blue letters by a local artist, made Grace roll her eyes the first time she saw it, and then secretly beam when she thought no one watched. Emily ran the clinic with a mix of practicality and stubborn compassion, charging what people could pay, partnering with shelters and advocacy groups to make sure women and children in trouble knew there was a door they could walk through. Tom and Linda came into town every week, Tom hauling crates of vegetables from their garden, Linda ladling soup in the small community kitchen Emily had insisted on adding to the back. Cole remained with the Seals, but he had arranged his life so that his time off seemed to orbit the valley. On some visits, he came alone, weariness around his eyes and sand still in his hair from far-flung coasts. On others, he arrived with Ranger and a handful of volunteers from a nearby rescue organization, bringing in dogs that needed socializing. The waiting room filled with the sound of small bodies hitting the floor to hug furry necks, with the chatter of children telling secrets into patient ears. Ranger, older now, moved a bit more slowly, gray dusting his muzzle, but his eyes remained bright. He let toddlers tug his collar, let teenagers lean against him when words were too hard, and always found his way to Grace when she entered a room, as if to check that the girl he had first kept warm in a blizzard was still here, still laughing. On one quiet winter afternoon, snow fell in a soft curtain outside the clinic's wide front window. Inside, the air smelled of soup and hand sanitizer and crayons. Grace, taller now, helped a younger child pick stickers after a vaccine. Tom argued gently with Linda over how much salt to add to the pot. Cole and Ranger sat on the floor, surrounded by a semicircle of kids who listened wide-eyed to a toned-down story about a storm and a mountain and how sometimes the people you find in the worst weather become the reason you step outside again. Emily stood in the doorway and watched them. There was a moment, suspended and ordinary, when she felt the weight of what had not happened, the silence that could have swallowed them, the grave that could have been dug in her name without her say. Instead, there was this. A soldier who had once believed his life was only about missions. A dog who had turned from weapon to bridge. An older couple who had thought their time for parenting was over. A young woman who had walked out of the snow carrying a child and a future she refused to surrender. A girl who had been abandoned on a road and now chose, again and again, to reach for hands instead of fear. Around a battered wooden table, they shared one large pot of stew, laughing at some joke that would mean nothing to anyone outside this odd constellation. Beyond the glass, winter kept doing what winter does. Inside, where breath and stories and second chances tangled together, they had built something that did not depend on blood or law, something stitched from courage, kindness, and a quiet promise repeated in every small choice. The violence stops here. Whatever storms waited beyond these mountains, they were no longer facing them alone. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't come with parted seas or thunder in the sky. They come quietly, through a neighbor who opens their door, a child who chooses trust again, a soldier who refuses to look away, or even a tired old dog who simply stays when the night feels too long. In stories like Emily's and Grace's, we're reminded that God is still at work in the middle of our ordinary storms, stitching new families out of broken pieces and turning "this is the end" into "this is where healing begins." If your own life feels like a winter road right now, know this: God has not forgotten you. The same God who guided a Navy SEAL up a mountain and a frightened mother out of the snow can send the right person, the right word, the right open door into your everyday life too. Sometimes the miracle is not that the storm disappears, but that you are given the strength and the people to walk through it. If this story touched your heart, let it keep traveling. Share this video so someone else who feels alone in their storm can find a little warmth. Comment your prayer, your story, or simply a few words of encouragement for others reading. Subscribe to join this growing family of stories about courage, faith, and the kind of love that doesn't give up. May God bless you and your home, protect every child and every weary heart watching this, and place His gentle hand over anyone who feels like they are walking through the snow alone tonight.